I have the honor to introduce our next keynote. I want to tell you a little bit about how we came to inviting Mr. Smooth to join us at our summit. So in the first phase of our project, the Alaska Native Dialogues on Racial Equity, Andor, we knew pretty early on, after having conversations with folks in our community, that the small staff within First Alaskans Institute, at the time I think we had 7 staff, weren't going to be enough manpower to have as many conversations as we needed to have throughout Alaska. And so we put out a call to other folks in the community, roughly between the ages of 20 and 40, wildly diverse, incredibly awesome folks from within and outside of Alaska, asking them to join us in becoming hosts in the way that we host conversations based on our Indigenous values, asking them to be hosts of these conversations within their communities and within their spheres of influence. And in that first phase, we were really excited that 17 folks responded to the call and said, I want to be part of this movement. And for many of us, we had never hosted conversations on race or racism. And even the thought of entering into a room and having these difficult conversations made us feel, like Liz was talking about earlier, that tightening in your stomach and feeling like you almost want to avoid the conversation because it's so hard. But they were brave and willing to enter into those conversations with us. As we were thinking about how can we think of different ways to help people see that there's a different way, a better way of having conversations about race and racism, as we were thinking about that, we attended the W.K. Kellogg Foundation America Healing Conference, and we got to be alongside other grantees doing this work throughout the country. And we saw a video there that, for me, kind of shifted forever the way that I think about how we could have these conversations on race. And the video that we saw, it's like 3 minutes long maybe, was how to tell someone they sound racist. And it was made by Mr. J. Smooth. And I'm really hoping that he'll have the time to share that video with you, because for us, bringing hosts into this conversation of race, it was a way of saying, you know what, there are a lot of ways that we could have this conversation. We can come at it from many different ways. And he has gone on to have many other video clips. He's a prolific interneter. Interwebber. Really, as someone who's putting himself out there, he's weaving a web of social justice advocates around the United States, including your Andor family. So I want to thank you for the gift that you've given us of sharing your perspective, your experience, and a new way of having these conversations on race. So with no further ado, I would love to invite Mr. J. Smooth to the stage. Please help me welcome him.
Wow, all right. Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Yeah, my name is Jay Smooth. Yeah, I come from the world of hip hop where we have names like that. Back when I was 16 years old, I started working at a radio station in New York named WBAI, part of the Pacific Network, which has a long tradition of progressive programming. I started working there under Amy Goodman, who at the time ran the local news and has gone on to do Democracy Now!, which I think does a lot of great work in this field. And yeah, back at that time, Jay Smooth was a normal hip-hop name. Nowadays, people hear that name and assume I run some sort of pickup artist website or something. But I like to hold on to it because I've been blessed by my relationship with hip hop to have a long career, a lifelong relationship with this culture, and the voice hip hop gave me has allowed me to be a part of the conversation on issues I care about, including all of the issues that we're discussing here. So, I like to keep the name because it keeps me from taking myself too seriously. It reveals things about people sometimes, people who are prone to certain prejudices and superficial judgments. When they hear that's my name, I can read it and how they react. And most of all, it keeps me grounded in my connection to the hip hop culture that gave me my voice to be here. And I want to spend some time talking about my relationship with that culture because I've been so moved by being here. I have a lot of notes also, just like EJ, because I've been getting so much food for thought already, just seeing those multiple generations of dancers yesterday at the reception, hearing all the elders speak, just seeing that spirit of just resilience and commitment to preserving culture, maintaining community around culture, and having that community and culture be the bedrock of the work that we do every day to counteract, challenge, resist those systems that keep that very culture in jeopardy. And I by no means, with anything I'm going to say, mean to equate whatever struggles we have with hip hop to what indigenous peoples face. I don't mean to say that there's anything at the same scale or magnitude, but there's been so much already that resonated with me, and so much that I'll take home as inspiration and education, and inspiration to look for ways for us to connect our work and our struggles, which is something that I know already goes on. So I want to speak a bit about my relationship with hip-hop culture, which some of you may know. The origin story of the culture is in New York City, in the South Bronx. In the 1970s, the most desolate corners of the city, and they were not desolate by chance. It was by plan, it was by strategy. People like Robert Moses wanted us to be in that predicament. And we came together, we cobbled together the scraps of technology that we had and built this patchwork of our cultural influences from Jamaica, the Afro-Cuban musical traditions, African call and response traditions, and used all these tools to carve out a space in this most desolate part of the city where we could share our cultural expression, our freshest dances, our freshest gear, share our voices together and see and be seen and reaffirm our own humanity within that space in the midst of this environment that was trying to strip us of our humanity at every turn. And I think it's important to bear in mind that there's a mythology around hip hop that from its earliest days, it was meant to be an expressly political tool, that it was a voice for political agency. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the essence of hip hop's value and its origins was in carving out a space for pleasure, for joy, for expression of culture, for the party. Hip hop originally, there was no such thing as a hip hop record or a hip hop song. Hip hop was a communal event. You had a hip hop party. And there's a quote from UCLA professor Robin D.G. Kelly. When social scientists explore expressive cultural forms, or what has been called popular culture, most reduce it to expressions of pathology, compensatory behavior, or creative coping mechanisms to deal with racism and poverty. And while some aspects of Black expressive culture certainly helps inner city residents deal with and even resist ghetto conditions, most of the literature ignores what the cultural forms mean for the practitioners. Few scholars acknowledge that what might also be at stake here are aesthetics, style, and pleasure. So I think it's important to keep in mind and honor that hip hop's revolutionary act was carving out a space for joy, for pleasure, for the party. And I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone here that carving out that space for cultural expression can then become a dangerous, rebellious, profoundly political act. And that's the role that hip hop played in New York. It's gone on to be replicated around the world, given that space for invisible people to come together and see and be seen. It did it for us so powerfully that the invisible people had the whole world watching. Then, of course, the whole world co-opted and sort of neutralized it and flattened it out. But we still, on a grassroots community level, there are so many of us who still cultivate that hip-hop tradition that we grew up on of using it as a space for that grassroots community expression. And that's the role it played for me from a really early age. I was a very socially isolated kid, didn't feel like I had a place to fit in part because of some of the implicit biases that EJ was speaking about. You know, as someone of mixed descent, my father is black and my mother is white, but people often aren't sure what to make of me when they see me, so I would often, growing up, have a conversation I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is the "what are you" conversation. And I've come to value that experience now because I think it gives a lot of insight into how strange and complex and irrational but vitally important to understand our whole construct of race is, because it gives us an insight into the in-group, out-group categorizations that we all usually make on an unconscious level without thinking about it. Whenever we meet someone, we go through a thought process of deciding, is that an us or a them? And we usually do it without even having a conscious thought. But when someone's not sure what to make of you, it throws a wrench in that and brings it to a conscious and often verbal level and makes us have to confront, well, we're having an interaction that doesn't actually make a lot of sense, and it gives us something to unpack. But back when I was a teenager, trying to build this sort of frail sense of self at all, anticipating that hitch in every conversation made it that much harder for me to want to go out there and connect and believe I had a place in the world. And it was finding a space within the community of hip-hop culture in the 80s growing up that made me feel like I could have a place and have a voice. And I became one of what are now multiple generations of hip-hop activists, hip-hop educators who try to replicate that hip-hop tradition of using creativity and creative community to carve out space for the outcast, for the underdog, for the people who are forced into invisibility. And that work is what I try to replicate when I speak on other social issues. I try to replicate the same sort of traditions of communication that we have within hip-hop, because in order to maintain that sort of community, if you're going to have a lifelong relationship with a culture or a community, you need to learn how to speak across difference within the community. And anyone who is an adult hip-hopper who tries to be a thoughtful citizen of the world is going to be coming up against things within the culture that we don't respect or appreciate at all. You know, we've come to internalize a lot of the same oppressive mechanisms that made hip-hop necessary, and that means that you need to find ways within your community to call people out, challenge each other, and be as blunt as you need to be, while also honoring the shared connection that you have between them as a part of that culture, finding a way to call people out with compassion and have an open space for communication and deal with difference without just alienating each other from our collective humanity, which is a practice I've had lots of experience with within hip hop, and I try to bring that same tradition to speaking on other issues, probably racism, racial justice first and foremost. So I guess I'll show a video that we spoke about earlier, which I made in 2008, which is named How to Tell Someone They Sound Racist. Race, the final frontier. No matter what channel you watch, no matter what feed you aggregate, it seems like everybody everywhere is talking about race right now. And when everybody everywhere is talking about race, that means sooner or later you're gonna have to tell somebody that they said something that sounded racist. So you need to be ready and have a plan in place for how to approach the inevitable "that sounded racist" conversation. And I'm going to tell you how to do that. The most important thing that you've got to do is remember the difference between the "what they did" conversation and the "what they are" conversation.
Those are two totally different conversations, and you need to make sure that you pick the right one. The what they did conversation focuses strictly on the person's words and actions and explaining why what they did and what they said was unacceptable. This is also known as the "that thing you said was racist" conversation, and that's the conversation that you want to have. The what they are conversation, on the other hand, takes things one step further and uses what they did and what they said to draw conclusions about what kind of person they are. This is also known as the "I think you are a racist" conversation. This is the conversation you don't want to have, because that conversation takes us away from the facts of what they did and the speculation about their motives and intentions, and those are things you can only guess at, you can't ever prove, and that makes it way too easy for them to derail your whole argument. And that is the part that's crucial to understand. When you say, "I think he's a racist," that's not a bad move because you might be wrong. That's a bad move because you might be right. Because if that dude really is racist, you want to make sure you hold him accountable and don't let him off easy. And even though intuitively it feels like the hardest way to hit him is just run up on him and say, "I think your ass is racist," when you handle it that way, you're actually letting him off easy, because you're setting up a conversation that's way too simple for him to derail and duck out of. Just think about how this plays out every time a politician or a celebrity gets caught out there. It always starts out as a what they did conversation, but as soon as the celebrity and their defenders get on camera, they start doing judo flips and switching it into a what they are conversation. "I have known this person for years, and I know for a fact that they are not a racist, and how dare you claim to know what's inside their soul just because they made one little joke about watermelon tap dancing and going back to Africa." And then you try and explain that we don't need to see inside their soul to know that they shouldn't have said all that about the watermelon, and you try to focus on the facts of the situation, but by then it's too late, because the what they are conversation is a rhetorical Bermuda Triangle where everything drowns in a sea of empty posturing until somebody just blames it all on hip-hop and we forget the whole thing ever happened. Don't let this happen to you. When somebody picks my pocket, I'm not going to be chasing him down so I can figure out whether he feels like he's a thief deep down in his heart. I'm going to be chasing him down so I can get my wallet back. I don't care what he is, but I need to hold him accountable for what he did. And that's how we need to approach these conversations about race. Treat them like they took your wallet and focus on the part that matters, holding each person accountable for the impact of their words and actions. I don't care what you are. I care about what you did.
So that was a video I made back in 2008 during that presidential election, and most YouTube videos have a shelf life of about 48 hours and then they go away, and I'm equally incensed about each video I make every week, so I didn't expect the outcome to be any different with this one, but this one has had a totally different staying power than most of my other videos. People still come back to it all the time. It's become a part of the curriculum in schools and colleges across the country, and sort of become part of the canon of race arguments, which I think speaks to how much of a hunger there is, as has been said repeatedly, of different ways to have the race conversation. And I think the most important shift that needs to happen, and this, when I named it "How To," I was being facetious. I didn't think people would keep watching it past that next week. Of course, there is no one correct way to approach any of these conversations, but I think one of the most important shifts we can make is not assuming that a conversation about racism is a conversation about you and whether you're a good person. We tend to think of racism as a good person, bad person dichotomy. Racism is something that bad people do. If I'm good, then I must not be racist. And that way of thinking, it obscures the reality of how race and racism, how prejudice function within each of us. You know, as EJ said, there are still plenty of blatant racists out there, but they, to me, are a lot less worrisome than not only covert racists who act on those beliefs in silence, but the many of us who are egalitarian, well-meaning, consciously good, progressive, liberal people, but who are not mindful on a daily basis of the gaps in our knowledge, the prejudices we all naturally develop with all of the media stimuli that push us in that direction every day, and all of the processes of unconscious implicit bias that we're all prone to having. You know, just like the in-group, out-group categorization I was talking about. We all, as good people, are prone to developing and letting implicit bias fester, and the thing that most allows it to fester is if we are comfortable in the assumption that we are good people, therefore we don't have to cultivate a daily practice of being good, which means being mindful of those tendencies that we all have within us. And those tendencies are insidious. They work to disguise themselves from us. One of the first studies about implicit bias in the 70s was about who will help victims of a traffic accident that they see in the street. They studied white people who see either a black or a white person in a traffic accident, and they found that if the white person seeing this accident believed that no one else witnessed the accident, they would help the black person at the same rate as the white person. But if they were aware that other people had also witnessed the accident, and therefore they had another explanation consciously for why they weren't going to help, under those circumstances, they were significantly less likely to help the black victim than the white victim. And that, for many people, is something that will happen unconsciously. It's not that they calculated, I have an excuse, so I'm not going to help the black person. This is a process that's disguised from yourself within your own mind. It's a game that you play on yourself without even realizing it. And that's why it's crucial not to believe, not to go through life believing that your belief in your own goodness is enough. We have to shift towards goodness as a practice that we all cultivate every day, in the knowledge that what connects us all as human beings is our human imperfection. And we need to cultivate that relationship of honoring our imperfection by cultivating goodness as a practice. But it's very difficult to do that when any mention of racism immediately brings up all these defense mechanisms about whether I'm a good person, which you see right now in the debate over the Oscars, having an all-white list of nominees. You've seen so many older white Academy members say, well, we're not sitting there looking at the black names and deciding we're not going to pick them. Well, of course that's not what's going on. It's happening on other levels that you're not even thinking about, but that's not a good enough excuse. If you are comfortable in the status quo and are not actively trying to counteract it, the status quo is going to continue. I've experienced this in my own life as the host of a hip-hop radio show for 25 years. For most of that history, my show has replicated hip-hop's pattern of being extremely male-dominated. I never made a conscious choice, I want to maintain a room full of dudes. I just went about not thinking about it consciously week to week, and the end result is a room full of dudes, because an unjust status quo is going to perpetuate itself unless you are on an everyday basis being mindful and making sure to check yourself on it. And it's only in the last 5 or 10 years that I've really done the work on a regular basis to counteract that, and I still need to do more on it. And at Race Forward, where I work, a great racial justice organization, they found in their work that if you, within an institution, implement what they call equity primes or equity prompts, if you have a reminder whenever there's a choice point that where your implicit bias could come up, if you have some sort of ritual in place to remind you, that mitigates, that lessens the possibility of that implicit bias acting out. Similar to, I have a personal tradition when I'm leaving the house, left to my own devices, I will always forget either my phone, my keys, or my wallet. So I have implemented a practice of whenever I'm leaving the house, I say, phone, keys, wallet, phone, keys, wallet, phone, keys, wallet. And if we can all do that in our institutions, in our day-to-day life as citizens, if we can have a racial or an implicit bias phone, keys, wallet that we practice every day, that can, we've found, help have some effect. It's not a panacea, but it has some effect on how much our implicit bias plays out within the systems that keep all these inequities intact. Because as EJ said, that's our conversation ultimately needs to be focused on these systems. That's why it can't be a narcissistic, am I good or not conversation, because we can all be good people in the cogs of a wheel that's maintaining those inequities. And that's the question that I thought George Freese spoke to so powerfully yesterday, and I was so moved to see him stand. I mean, just that he's still standing and still here, and that he's able to come up and speak so powerfully and express a commitment to this work is just, it's such a powerful thing. And I'm going to share something personal. My partner, June, passed away very unexpectedly a few months ago. And we met doing this work, so I always think of her at times like this. And it's been very difficult getting back to work since then, but seeing George standing up there after everything he's been through and just being around all this energy here has really meant a lot to me. It's been really inspiring. So I want to try to speak to the question that George posed so powerfully yesterday, which is how do you keep showing up in the face of injustice that seems so intractable, in the face of an unjust system that has no fear and no accountability? And I don't have an answer to how we win that battle, but I've been thinking a lot over the last few years about what it means to keep showing up, how you find value in that struggle, especially around the evolution of the movement for Black lives, and how intractable those struggles seem, even given all of this newfound capacity we have to build global coalitions, the newfound ability more than ever to speak across difference, those questions of intersectionality that EJ spoke about. This generation is far more on point than anyone else has been about being able to challenge each other when we may be on the same page and on the same team in terms of our race and culture, but in terms of gender, one of us might need to check each other, or sexuality, or religion, or class. I think we've developed more skills than ever about being able to talk across those differences, which I think is a lot of the work that's going on here already. And yet, police are still shooting young Black men and women at the same rate, and are maybe this much more likely to be held accountable. So the question is, how do you keep showing up, especially when this younger generation is burdened with constant comparisons to the civil rights era, which we remember as being defined by all these grand, sweeping victories. So I've been spending a lot of time looking back at that era, and especially at Dr. Martin Luther King's work and how his work evolved. And I think it's important, let me say just in general, to dig a little deeper and really look at the whole of his work and the legacy of his thought, because there's been an ongoing process of flattening him out for decades now and making it a more anodyne, harmless message. And let me see if I can find this quote. There's a quote I've been seeing a lot recently from Dr. King that I think is a perfect example. Let me see if I have that here. Here it is, yeah. So there's a quote: "Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others?" This is a quote from Dr. King that's cited quite often. There's a tape of President Obama saying it, and I'm not hating on this sentiment. It's a perfectly benign, positive sentiment, but it's not very substantive or challenging. And it also, as far as I can surmise, is not something that Dr. King ever said out loud. And I have to credit Professor Blair Kelly at NC State University for digging into this. That quote was in the prepared text of a speech that he gave in 1957. But when he delivered the speech, he didn't actually say that line. So it's not a fake quote, but someone went to great lengths to find this quote and propagate it. And I think that's a perfect example of the ongoing project America has to flatten Dr. King's legacy into a Hallmark card. So I think it's important not to fall into that habit and to dig a little deeper, because that's, if you look at the full context of how Dr. King spoke about service, when he said service, he wasn't talking about giving some money to charity and then feeling like you did something. He was always clear that you need to be working to challenge the system that makes it necessary for these charities to exist, for people to need charity. He said, "We are called upon to help the discouraged beggars in life's marketplace, yes, but one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. So I think it's important not to fall into that habit of being satisfied with a sanitized Dr. King. And I think it's especially important as we look at all of the work that we engage in to look at the entire scope of his work. And it's not only his work, of course, he was part of a community that made that movement possible. There is no Dr. King without Bayard Rustin, without Diane Nash, without Ella Baker, and on and on and on. But if you look at the work that each of them were doing, you know, it's compared to Black Lives Matter, and people will say Black Lives Matter has a lot of energy, but they're not really getting anything done. They have no master plan. Trying to find a couple of other quotes. Oh, yeah, they seem to be groping for something they never find. They're wasteful and self-defeating. But the thing about those sorts of complaints, like those last two quotes, wasteful and self-defeating and seem to be groping for something which they never find, are actually word for word things that people said about Dr. King in the last few years of his career. Wasteful and self-defeating is from a New York Times editorial named Dr. King's Error, about his now famous and well-respected speech at Riverside Church against the Vietnam War. And Groping for Something Which It Never Finds was a review of his last book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? And that's a crucial part of the history of that era that gets left out, is that most of that era was not defined by these grand sweeping victories or master plans being carried out. It was defined by tireless work, banging your head against a wall, trying to find the next step, and having no one around you believe that it's even worth continuing to show up, you know, haters and doubters at every turn. And especially in those last 3 years of his life after the victories that we saw documented in the Selma movie, Dr. King had a clear focus on this being what he called the post-civil rights era for Black people in America, which he said must be a new era of revolution. We must recognize that we can't solve our problem until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. This means a revolution of values and other things. We must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together. You can't really get rid of one without getting rid of the other. The whole structure of American life must be changed. And that's the dilemma that that's the crisis, the dilemma, the challenge he was facing the last 3 years of his life. And there were no grand victories at all in those last 3 years. He put out his last book, Chaos or Community. The book was a flop, almost no one bought it. He started a campaign trying to support workers in Chicago, the biggest campaign up until then in the North from the civil rights movement. After a year, he came away with almost nothing. He did that speech at Riverside Church. Even people within his own circle told him, you shouldn't be taking it there, you shouldn't be trying to make this the message now. And he was waking up every day racked with self-doubt. He considered getting therapy, but decided he couldn't because the constant surveillance from the FBI meant going to get therapy would be used against him. So his last years were defined by struggling to believe it was worth it to show up at all. And I talk about this not to suggest that his last few years were a failure, but to say that that lonely, thankless work that seems like it's never worth it day to day, Dr. King understood in those last few years that that is the work. That's what you have to show up for, that there is no grand victory in the work. You know, we look back on history and confuse the triumphs with the work, but he understood that you need to show up every day and keep picking yourself back up for that next step forward, because that's the only way that we take those small steps bit by bit towards real equality and justice. And just to close the circle, he did, within that last year, find new inspiration with the Poor People's Campaign and with his alliance with the sanitation workers, whose plight brought him to Memphis on that fateful day when he passed. So I think it's important to look back at Dr. King's career and see that there were no grand victories in those last years, but the lesson he reaffirmed was, even when there are no moments of glory, showing up each day to do the work, to be with your community, is a glory in itself, and is where your humanity is most affirmed, is where you're most in touch with your common humanity, is where you're supposed to be. And I feel very connected to that here with you all, and very honored to be a part of this, because this is a 10,000-year effort without a doubt, and we need to cultivate that space of culture and community that provides a foundation and pass that on, and we need to pass on the struggle and show up every day and be together doing the work, because that's where the glory and the essence of our humanity is. It's not in a triumph that's on the horizon, although if we keep doing the work every day, we take steps bit by bit, even if they're imperceptible. The glory is in being here with you right now, asking those questions, challenging each other with compassion, talking across differences to come closer together, and figuring out how to do the work that gets us that much closer to the world we need to have. So I just want to thank you all for having me here. It's been really inspirational.
Oh, man. Thank you, not only for sharing your experience and your inspiration, but also for calling June into this space with us. You know, that's something that I hear resonating over and over again, is that we continue to walk in the steps of giants, and that's part of what brings us back to this work.